Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Lando Norris has opened up on the increasing strain in his relationship with world champion Max Verstappen. Over the last few rounds, things have got increasingly spicy between the pair of them, certainly Austin and the Mexico Grand Prix. Lando says that in some way he's somewhat surprised how Max is off the track when they are good friends, potentially, whereas on the track it's a rather different story. Does Lando need to buck up his ideas if he wants to be a world champion? Because the mentality of a champion is arguably different to what Lando has displayed for the majority of this season. Very much into your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. Plenty going on in F1 right now, such as this today from Mick Schumacher, former Formula 1 driver, and he says the following on Instagram: life doesn't always go as planned, and setbacks can be tough to face, but every challenge is an opportunity or a chance to learn, grow, and come back even stronger. This is just a chapter, not the whole story. The journey continues, and I'm determined to rise above it. Thanks all for the support. So, cryptic, kind of. What's he talking about? Obviously, we can speculate what he's talking about. There's a couple of options. Well, he wasn't going to get an F1 drive anyway this season. There was some discussion around Alpine, just because he's been with them on the WEC side for a little while. They're getting Jack Doohan as their driver, although they might get Colapinto. That's been an interesting point, that apparently Alpine are very much interested in signing Colapinto, although it seems like Red Bull will win that race if they want to, effectively, is the way that it stands. But Mick, of course, the Mercedes opportunity has been a question, because we know that Toto speaks very highly of Mick and has had him in that Mercedes stable. But when it comes to potentially giving him opportunities, they've not really existed. A move to Williams has never materialised. When given the opportunity to put a rookie in here, Schumacher's not a rookie, right, but to put a young driver in a car alongside George Russell when Hamilton is stepping away to Ferrari, Schumacher was an option, but an option that was never seriously considered. And Andrea Kimi Antonelli, an actual rookie, is getting that spot instead. Is that a good decision? I believe so. Is Mick the driver that many hoped he would be? Maybe not. But look, at the end of the day, he was still a solid driver in his time at Haas, was maybe mistreated on some level by Quintana. There's an argument there at Haas, but it's a cutthroat sport. And I think what this is probably talking about is the reserve driver situation at Mercedes. Mick's been working with those guys for some time, and the latest rumour has it, Bottas is going to be their reserve driver, right? Because Bottas is not getting the Sauber drive for next year, so he's likely getting the Mercedes reserve opportunity until maybe a better spot comes along down the line, and that would mean Mick Schumacher's out of a gig. So that's the theory as to what this is all talking about, but intrigue to your thoughts in the comment section below. This as well, loads happening lately. The FIA has been in chaos. Ben Sulliv's firing everyone under the sun, or they're just leaving. And Greg Maffei, top man at Liberty Media, is stepping down, being fired, whatever. I mean, it seems to me that as a CEO of one of these massive companies, corporations, if the board of directors want you gone, then you're going to go. It's pretty rare that you leave of your own accord. Now, of course, Liberty Media do other things than just own Formula 1, but there has been some discussion as to whether anything has, with an F1 relationship has resulted in Maffei's departure. And there was a rumour a while ago that Liberty Media were considering selling Formula 1, just because, you guys might remember this actually, apparently the Saudis wanted to buy it or something, and Ben Sulayem was saying that the number that was thrown on it was too high, and Liberty Media were like, hey, excuse me, who are you as the president of the governing body to try and say what sort of valuation our sport deserves? Don't try and play it down. That's like against the whole point. Now, whether they would actually sell it, I don't know, but Liberty Media have, of course, done a good job over the last few years, massively boosting the value of the sport, so there's an argument to say they could sell and get out of there. Now, would that be good? I mean, we know what Liberty have done for social media and that side of the sport, and it's been massively beneficial. And Maffei says they're not going to sell it, or at least there's no plans to. But, do we believe these guys? I don't know. It's still pretty interesting. The other drama at Formula 1 management and Liberty Media is Domenicali, obviously. And there was a rumour yesterday, I don't really know where this came from, but there was a rumour yesterday that he's going to leave his position as F1 CEO, of course, former Ferrari top man, now F1 CEO, basically, and is going to become CEO of MotoGP, because Liberty Media are buying that up as well. And this would be surprising, for sure, and it was just seemingly another major announcement or major move happening just days after it's all been happening here in Formula One. But Luke Smith says this ain't true. He's from The Athletic, says don't know what you're talking about. And Scott Mitchell-Marm here today says the following: another day, another bit of speculation. No plan for Domenicali to leave the F1 leadership role and switch to MotoGP, I am told. It is possible Domenicali will offer advice and support once MotoGP is officially part of the fold, which may be why the misunderstanding emerged. And Domenicali sticking around is part of why Liberty Media CEO Greg Maffei stepping down has been dismissed as essentially changing nothing for F1 in the short term. So it seems like nothing's going to happen. This is, by the way, on Blue Sky. It's like a new app that's come along. It's basically Twitter, isn't it? But it's a new one that isn't Twitter or X, whatever they call it nowadays. I don't know if this will really go anywhere. I know there's been other ones like this in the past that people don't really use, so I don't know, we'll see. But it's interesting and it's nice and centered on the screen, which I quite like. So there is that it has going for it. And probably it has a dark mode as well if I actually decided to make an account for it, which I probably won't do, but you know, who knows? If lots of F1 people are there and it gains some traction, maybe. But we've seen these things before with like, oh, new Twitter like competitor, and everyone just stays on Twitter. But of course there are problems with the platform. But I'm back at it again with Motorsport Week. Now, Max Verstappen has been in lots of conversations, and we're going to discuss what Lando had to say about him in a few minutes' time. One of the other dramas, though, has been the FIA, and Max has, quite clearly said that F1's less fun with these whole language regulations that have been coming into play as well. I feel like the FIA, they have to decide. No, what they've done here is kind of ridiculous, because Max swore, he got community service, Charles swore, and then he was like, oh, sorry guys, and they still brought him in to see the stewards about it. Like, it's just so outrageous. And the GDPA, or whatever, the Drivers Association, they came out with a statement, or the Grand Prix, it's GPDA, isn't it? Grand Prix Drivers Association. They came out and said that, I don't know what the FIA are playing at. They've got really no right and understanding to police any of this stuff. But speaking of Charles Leclerc, just wanted to spend a couple of minutes here talking about Ferrari and what their situation is going to be for next year, because they confirmed that they lost quite a lot of time on their development of flexi wings. We know that McLaren and seemingly Mercedes were kind of pushing the boundaries more than others on the flexi wing stuff. Ferrari, a few rounds ago, I think it was Singapore, they introduced their flexi wing, and it's worked wonders for them in many respects, with making their car substantially stronger than it previously was. But the way they describe this implied that, there's potentially more to come from the flexibility of the wings. Whether the FIA really clap down on it next year and say, all right, guys, no more BS in terms of the flexibility, but they've tried that before and it never really works. So the reality is, I think Ferrari have more to come from the flexibility they can employ for next season, which is maybe a reason why 2025 is looking good for them, which I'm sure that it will. The big question that many have, though, because Ferrari are likely to be a championship contender next year, they, then obviously a championship contender this year in terms of the constructors, and in the drivers they could well have been if not for that very difficult stint in the middle of the season, especially for Charles Leclerc. Once they, the upgrades failed in Spain, they've got back on track now, but it's cost them too many points in the championship. But next year with Leclerc and Hamilton in the car, it's almost certain that Ferrari will be in the mix for the championship. The question is whether they're going to be in the mix for the drivers, I guess. Will Verstappen be too strong? Again, where McLaren going to be? How can Mercedes even do? Could Russell or even somehow Antonelli deliver a number if Mercedes can get on top of their car? But that does not seem right now especially likely. I think this whole Leclerc-Hamilton dynamic, though, is fascinating, because Hamilton clearly doesn't like this generation of cars as much as the previous generation. They're boats, basically. He wants more front end from the car, but that compromises so much on the rear. And maybe that's just a Mercedes problem, and he's trying to compromise that. But we know that Hamilton, has made it quite clear that he doesn't really like these ground effect era cars. And at the end of the day, next year's cars are going to be relatively similar to this year's cars, and it's been a tough season for Hamilton. So that's one thing that might go Leclerc's way. Of course, qualifying pace. Leclerc would be tough to stop. Of course, look, Hamilton has the most pole positions in the history of Formula One, so that's going to be a fascinating battle. I think it's a really interesting conversation, because if Ferrari have the best car for, let's say, the next 2 to 3 seasons, and they win the championship on the driver's side for the next 2 to 3 seasons, who is the champion in those seasons? Because I think next year, Leclerc has the benefit of being around Ferrari for a few years now. Hamilton's just coming in, but of course he's Hamilton. He's going to get excellent treatment in the team. And I think in terms of a championship contender for Max and being in a fight that goes down to the wire, I'd probably, put faith in Hamilton to be more, of a threat to Verstappen next year, or to whoever the real contenders are next year, than Leclerc would be. But I feel like if Leclerc's in a proper battle like that, and 2022 kind of was, but it fell away towards the end of the year and Max actually won the championship by miles when the Ferrari started to fall off and the crashes and, obviously Leclerc, the crash in France and Paul Ricard was still something that lives in the memory. So there's things like that that maybe Hamilton will be stronger at over 2025, but in 2026 the cars are going to change quite substantially, so who knows who that's going to favour, who that isn't, not even from a team's POV, but also from a driver's POV, and Leclerc should probably just get better and better. So I think that relationship of Ferrari is going to be super fascinating because those two are going to be very competitive with each other for sure, and they respect each other a lot. It's going to be friendly off the track for time, but if they are the championship contenders next year, I do not think it's going to be a clear-cut victory either way. And that is certainly relevant to this whole Max Verstappen, Lando Norris situation we'll get to in a second. But speaking of Red Bull, Isaac Hadjar, he's not this man, this is Colapinto. Hadjar is this man on screen, and he was in the fight for the Formula 2 championship. He actually says that, his chances are alive. He feels like he's got an opportunity to get the drive at Red Bull, or at least the B team. Now, he's probably not going to win this year's F2 championship. I think it's still possible. But Hadjar, he had a good start to the season, not so good recently, kind of when he didn't need to have a few underwhelming rounds. That started to creep in. And, I think Hadjar's okay. I don't think he's anything special from what I've watched. But again, Formula 2 is not, as we know, the best way to really tell how good a driver can be. The transition isn't the best from F2 to F1, and we also know that in F2, they say the cars are equal. The cars aren't really equal. Some of the engines are overpowered, and it's a topic for another day maybe. But look, Hadjar was in the conversation for Red Bull. He believes he still is, but now there's the talk about, well, instead of getting a Hadjar or an Iwasa, or of course Lindblad is potentially a driver they could look at in a couple of years as well when he's old enough to drive. Instead of looking at those guys, they're going to look at Colapinto from out of the Red Bull stable. And Hadjar says there's lots going on at VCarb and Red Bull right now. Anything can happen. And obviously, I'm next on the list. That is just a fact. But it is interesting because it wasn't actually that long ago that there were lots of conversations on Hadjar maybe getting the drive at one of the Red Bull teams. But that's no longer looking especially likely because it's going to be Lawson, Tsunoda, and then, Max and potentially Colapinto in some order. And it's not like Max is leaving Red Bull Racing. So, we can pretty much figure it out from there. But let's talk about this whole Lando Norris situation, right? Because we know that these two guys, Norris and Verstappen, good friends off the track. At least good friends they were a few months ago. I can imagine that the relationship now is slightly different to what it was. Maybe not substantially different, but they have been in a battle on track, and I think really Austria was one of the boiling points because Lando looked pretty good to win that race. He had way more pace than Max at the end of the Grand Prix. Max defended very hard. Lando attacked very hard, to be fair, as well, and I think both of them were at times over the line. But they had the coming together. Max pulled over, squeezed Lando onto the curb. They got the damage, they got the punctures. Max ends up finishing 5th, I believe. Lando ends up not finishing at all. And after that race, Lando basically said, if Max doesn't apologise, then I'm no longer his friend. Or he said something like that anyway, that the relationship wasn't going to be the same. Lando, basically Max never apologised and was like, that's racing, mate. And I think they kind of moved on. But over the last few rounds, certainly Austin, where they had the coming together a couple of times in the race, and then Mexico was really the chief example when Lando was on the radio saying this guy is dangerous, which it was. I mean, the move into turn 8 was as dangerous as you're really going to see in terms of a driving move this season in Formula 1. Things get pretty heated between the pair of them on track and, potentially off the track as well. Now, we know that Max will do whatever it takes to win the championship. We saw that this year, and he was able to use some of these tactics to limit his losses on rounds where he wasn't the fastest, and then he delivered the hammer blow in Brazil a couple of weekends to basically put the championship to bed. But Lando will have learned a lot from this championship. He may have learned a lot in terms of how he needs to, adapt himself as a driver. I think we saw it in Mexico that he was more aggressive in turn 4 and enabled Max to be penalised for that because he did really try and hang it around the outside, whereas he didn't quite, commit as much back in Austin, for example, in the move at turn 12. So I think we're seeing Lando be a little bit more aggressive, but even then, turn 1 in Austin didn't defend anywhere near hard enough. It's like, by the Austin Grand Prix, that's the race where I was really expecting Lando to have learned a lot of lessons from the season so far. I mean, Imola, Spain, among many other examples, Austria is another good one. Even like Silverstone to some degree, but obviously that was, McLaren poor decision making really on that side. But there were so many races where McLaren should have scored more points with Lando than they did. And so many races such as in Monza or in Hungary where Lando was in the lead starting on pole, and then that was not the case by the time they finished the first lap. Hungary was especially bad, of course. China's sprint race where Hamilton, schooled him basically into turn one. Like so many moments that I was expecting by Austin that, Lando would at least be far more aggressive in his defense, and he still let Max come up the inside and take the position from him, right? So, Max was the deserving champion of the season, and he's the guy who's going to win it. But Lando Norris will probably have learned a lot after this season going into next year. The question really comes in terms of mentality and whether Lando can develop the mentality of a champion, because he's got the talent. I don't think there's any denying that he's got the pace, the qualifying pace, the pace in the rain tends to be the case as well. Lando's a supremely talented driver, but the mental POV is always the perspective that calls into question, and I think you see a little bit of that here. He's very open, he's very honest with his emotions and stuff in F1, and that's probably okay, but it depends on whether some of the things that he says are really aligned with a winning mentality. Certainly a winning mentality, not just of a race winner, but of a champion. We know that Helmut Marko made the comment a while ago that Max is just mentally stronger than Lando, and therefore he's going to win the championship. And, I think basically Marko was right on the money there. So this is a comment that Lando made on Max's on-track antics, as it were, and he says the following: I'm kind of split on Max. You think how someone can be personally and how you can get along with people, as in, Max is a good friend off the track, can be very different, so different to how you are on the track. Which kind of implies some level of surprise, would be my read, on that Lando's almost like, to some degree, surprised that Max can be so, I don't know, loving and friendly or whatever, like such a quality friend and gentleman off the track, and yet when he's racing Lando, the same guy, on the track, once the visor comes down, it's a very different story. And this is true for, to some degree, every Formula One driver, but especially for the champions. They are totally ruthless. At least, multiple world champions, for example, the likes of a Verstappen, a Hamilton, a Senna, a Schumacher, names like that. They will yield not at all when it is not necessary to, especially when you have a rival where you feel like you can push them around, in which case Max probably feels about Lando. So I think that's what Lando needs to learn and realise, is that, Max is going to be a very different man on the track than he is. He's going to win at all costs. If that means crashing with your opponent and sending both of you into the wall in order to get the points on the board, that's something that champions in the past have done. And, the likelihood is that Max would do that if that's what it takes. And I think Lando does know this, he does realise this, but, executing on that and even adapting your own kind of feelings once the visor goes down might to some extent be necessary. Of course, it's kind of interesting just because Lando had not more to lose precisely, but because he was behind in the championship, Max can be happy just to take them both out of the race and no one's scoring points, and then Max is going to win the championship that way. So, it's not like Lando couldn't have yielded, but Juan Pablo Montoya, I think, made this point and said, look, at some point Lando's just got to stick his nose in and show Max that he's there and he's going to be a threat, because like Hamilton did, let's say, Silverstone 2021, otherwise Max is going to walk all over you. And Max even said this himself, that, look, I can very easily switch between race mode and non-race mode, and it's something that every driver has, but Max certainly has to a certain level, and, well, depending on how good next year's RB21 is, and depending how good next year's McLaren is, that is the question as to whether we get another Lando-Max battle for the championship, which we kind of had this season, and whether Lando would be better prepared to deal with it next year. But very much into your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.